The boardroom, with its glass walls and austere furniture, seemed to imbue every decision with an aura of power and seriousness that masked simmering tensions. I sat at the table, my notes meticulously organized, my laptop open before me, prepared for yet another crucial discussion about the contract I had painstakingly drafted months ago. But something felt different this day. Mark Stanton, with his arrogant smirk that belied his constant condescension, and Sophia Diaz, ever watchful and calculating sitting across from me, gave clear signs they weren't there for a level playing field. As I explained the clauses and highlighted key points ensuring the agreement's balance and security, I noticed their eyes drifting, their bodies shutting down to my words. Mark interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is too technical." A comment that, far from being a casual aside, carried the weight of someone aiming to erase the other from the scene. Sophia merely nodded, a subtle gesture sealing their silent complicity. They ignored the clause that, months later, would prove central to a dispute of significant proportions. I saw their condescending exchanges, as if my work was an irrelevant detail in the bigger picture. And it was at that precise moment that the phrase hammered into my mind, firm as a suppressed scream. They forgot who drafted the contract. I held my breath, maintaining a composed face as indignation swelled within. I couldn't let that disdain go unanswered. Every line of the contract had been drafted by me with obsessive care, attempting to foresee loopholes and ensure fairness where the game seemed uneven. They, however, weren't just dismissing those words. They were dismissing me. The feeling of betrayal was palpable, a spark of silent anger that fueled my convictions. But nothing is resolved with impulsive confrontations there, amidst fleeting glances and weak words. I kept my tone firm, but controlled, emphasizing the details of the clause and its potential impact, even though it seemed my words were slipping through Mark and Sophia's closed defenses. It was a game of invisibility. Trying to erase my name from that document, they wanted to erase my value as well. At the end of the meeting, I watched each gesture of disdain morph into arrogance. They didn't realize that by ignoring that contract, they were empowering me. I closed my folder decisively, as certainty crystallized. This would be the touchstone of my revenge and my professional affirmation. They had forgotten who drafted that document, but I would never forget. In that instant, the intellectual and strategic battle ahead took clear shape in my mind. It wasn't just a conflict over clauses. It was a fight for my name and my work to be recognized in that firm, in that market, in that environment. The coldness of my determination contrasted with the inner revolt. There was no room for weakness, only for a meticulous plan. I left the room not with euphoria, but with the conviction that I was starting something bigger than a simple disagreement. It was the beginning of my precise and calculated response, a journey that would lead to far more than the restoration of my credit. It was the beginning of my mission to break through the ceiling they were trying to impose on me, to finally show who had truly written that contract. Leaving the boardroom, the weight of silence filled each step I took. It wasn't just the disregard for that clause I had once drafted. It was the repeated pattern of disdain that, over the years, had been undermining my trajectory within that firm. To win the battle ahead, I needed to understand the players and the forces that, driven by self-interest and prejudice, had built this invisible network of resistance to my work. Mark Stanton, senior partner and owner of that arrogance-laden smirk, always underestimated my performance. I vividly remember the first time we reviewed a major company contract together. My technical suggestions, designed to protect the firm's interests, were rejected with a touch of impatience and the acidic comment that it was too technical. At those moments, what seemed like a simple professional judgment revealed itself to be a barrier embedded in his chauvinistic vision, which stifled the voices of women, like mine, who dared to question him. I swallowed my frustration and moved on, but I understood that I wouldn't lack for a fight. Carlos Peixoto, an external partner, certainly wasn't far behind. Behind his institutional appearances, his words leaked a subtle paternalism, almost always expressing admiration for a lawyer. It was praise with a hint of doubt, a constant reminder that, in his eyes, I needed to prove my ability beyond the legal. In these brief conversations, I felt the layers of prejudice that silently left their mark. Sofia Diaz, in turn, was the most calculating adversary. Unlike the rude Mark and the veiled condescension of Carlos, she was sneaky and strategic, always absorbing my ideas to then transform them into stepping stones in her own career climb. She observed my work with watchful, flickering eyes, noted details, and, without direct confrontations, diluted my influence behind the scenes. Our conflict didn't occur in words, but in every measured glance, in every silence, in every move made in the shadows of management. It was a dangerous game, where I retreated to study and learn her pattern. They formed the pillar of an invisible barrier, the glass ceiling that hindered female advancement in a sphere dominated by power politics and the perpetuation of the status quo. I knew that, however solid my technical background, it wouldn't be enough to change the scenario. For years, I tried to impose my presence there solely with legal arguments, believing that reason would be enough. But I quickly learned that, in the corporate arena, merit encounters obstacles in alliances, internal politics, and behavior. It was a minefield, where omissions and gestures spoke as loudly as speeches. Revisiting these experiences, as acidic as they were revealing, served to guide my next steps. Document by document, email by email, I noticed that Mark and Sofia were using their influence to disregard important protocols and clauses, while Carlos maintained a critical and sometimes dubious eye on my performance. The pattern outlined an organized and silent system of exclusion. This understanding was crucial. I realized that my strength didn't lie solely in the contract or the legal analyses, but in the ability to meticulously track the political movement within that structure. Law, for me, would no longer be just technical. It needed to be strategy, diplomacy, and power play. That night, I looked at my files and notes scattered across the office, thinking about how to put the pieces of this puzzle together. And the certainty that guided me was that the fight would be long and arduous, but possible. Mark, with his arrogance, trusted in the stability of the old order. Sofia, silent and astute, used my own weapons to achieve her ends. Carlos, with his paternalism, limited expectations based solely on what I represented as a woman in that environment. This, however, didn't paralyze me. It fueled me for what was to come. Knowing where and how to move, when to retreat, and when to advance, was the difference between succumbing and winning. And I had, at that moment, at my side, the cold determination that grew stronger each day. The battle was for my name and my work to finally be recognized. There, looking out the office window, the illuminated city, and the distant voices reminded me that the world revolved beyond the domains of those who tried to silence me. I promised myself I wouldn't back down, that every step forward would represent the reconstruction of my space. It wouldn't be impulsive revenge, but a calculated trajectory, marked by intelligence and resilience, not only for my own growth, but to pave the way for all the others who, like me, were fighting to break that invisible ceiling. And so, with a clear decision and a firm heart, I began to elaborate the route that would lead me not only to recognition, but to the transformation of the game. Because they had forgotten who had drafted the contract, and I was ready to remind them. The office routine, which had previously enveloped me with its exhausting and predictable rhythm, took on a different tone after that meeting. The feeling of having been ignored, of seeing the contract I drafted relegated to oblivion by Mark and Sofia, became the spark that ignited my determination. I needed to act, but not impulsively. My next moves would have to be based on concrete information, clear evidence that would give me the support to reverse that situation. In the following days, I organized my time with almost surgical precision. In everyone's eyes, I continued to perform my duties, participating in meetings and drafting documents. But, behind this facade, my energy was dedicated to something much bigger, a meticulous investigation to unearth details and build a strategic arsenal. I reviewed old contracts, analyzed precedents, and compiled relevant cases that, together, could support a solid position against the invisibility imposed on my authorship. Weekends, which I had previously reserved for rest or personal activities, became crucial moments to invest in this purpose. I arrived early at the office, the silent environment only interrupted by the growth of my notes and the delicate sound of the laptop keys. An ambiguous sensation flowed, the physical fatigue imposed by the countless hours, contrasting with the intellectual enthusiasm and the clarity of the objective that guided me. In this process, I focused especially on those clauses that Mark and Sophia had ignored. Each one gave clues to the real legal and financial impact of the contract. Behind the apparent overly technical nature they so criticized, there was a complex architecture that protected vital interests and guaranteed fair competition in the sector. It was essential to understand the context in order to be able to explain its value in future negotiations or litigation. Amidst this silent movement, unexpected information reached me. A discreet contact, typical of someone who knows the market, revealed the existence of a newly filed case that could put that key clause at the center of national debate. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a chance to transform my invisibility into a powerful voice. A subtle, yet crucial alert catalyzed my plan. Knowing the delicacy of the situation, I began to shape a strategy that encompassed not only the defense of the contract, but also my exit from that suffocating environment. I didn't just want to correct a mistake, I needed more. I aspired to conquer my space definitively, a place where my name would be respected, where my work would be unquestionable, where my career could climb without the arbitrary breaks of prejudice and internal politics. This exit plan didn't arise from an impetuous desire, but from a cold calculation. I knew how competitive the legal market was, and that my chances would take time to materialize if I remained tied to a structure that didn't value me. Gradually, the pieces of that scenario began to fit together in my mind. The urgency of the denunciation, the relevance of the situation, the opportunity to strengthen my reputation, and, above all, the absolute control of the narrative. Confidentially, I began to design alternatives that would allow me to take a step forward at the right moment. The articulation involved strategic contacts, in-depth analyses, and meticulous preparation for challenges that would surely come. There was no room for hesitation. Every move needed to be anticipated, every reaction calculated. The frustration of daily life, which had previously seemed like an obstacle, became a driving fuel. So, while many in the office lived their normal routines, I walked a silent path, immersed in research and revisions, determined to transform invisibility into prominence. I knew I would have to face resistance, doubts, and challenges, but that tide was finally beginning to turn in my favor. The strategic battle began there, in the details that only I had recorded in the contract and in the possibilities that recent litigation offered me. What was once just an ignored technical clause gained body and meaning. It wasn't just the contract, it was the testimony of my ability, of my voice that, until then, they hadn't recognized. That period of study and analysis wasn't just preparation. It was the seed of a new phase, where legal precision and strategic skill would be my allies in forging a path forward. In the solitude of my office, surrounded by papers, projections, and plans, there was only one certainty. My time of invisibility was over. The moment had arrived to use the law and my intelligence to do what few dared, to break the unspoken rules that had erased me and declare, with fact and justice, that the contract was mine, and that this could no longer be ignored. After the initial phase, where I became aware of the negligence I suffered, I plunged into even more intense and meticulous work. I knew that to transform my invisibility into a powerful voice, I needed not only to reaffirm my authorship of that contract, but also to dismantle a systemic structure that perpetuated the erasure of professionals like me. This was no longer a personal battle. It was an awakening to a system that, under the veil of professionalism, operated by fragmenting and undervaluing the contributions of female lawyers, using veiled prejudices and power strategies. To do this, I returned to previous litigations, ostensibly unrelated to my case, but which, after careful analysis, revealed a disturbing pattern. I identified numerous cases where clauses suggested or drafted by women were disregarded, ignored or undervalued in the final decisions. A modus operandi, silent and systematic, designed to maintain hierarchical structures and privilege certain groups. Mark Stanton and Sophia Diaz, more than isolated antagonists, were living expressions of this invisible network. Carlos Peixoto, unfortunately, confirmed the existence of institutional paternalism, a complicit silence that consolidated and concealed prejudices. I used advanced document analysis tools to map these connections. I automated searches in legal databases, linked information from lawsuits, internal emails, and meeting minutes, cross-referencing each piece of information to find evidence proving the existence of this exclusionary system. Each ignored clause was a link in an invisible but powerful chain. My findings pointed not only to negligence, but to a repeated strategy to delegitimize voices and work considered inconvenient. Interestingly, Sophia herself unintentionally collaborated to strengthen my case. Her subtle attempts to usurp my ideas left traces, superficial emails, agendas with scattered notes, altered documents, and revealed strategies that I was able to compile and analyze. These small oversights were crucial. While she sought to erase my presence, she provided the clues I needed to effectively break the silence that had suffocated me until then. Mark, in turn, was revealing in his arrogance. Through discreet contacts, I learned of internal conversations where he scorned my clauses, characterizing them as technical excesses that hampered the firm's interests. Those statements, far from mere slips, constituted a pattern of disdain and command that supported much more than professional disagreements. A grim commitment to maintaining the status quo at all costs. Each point I discovered broadened the scope of the problem. It wasn't just my case. It was the manifestation of a system that privileged some at the expense of others, relying on disguised prejudices to conceal its structural deficiencies. My personal battles were transforming into a larger symbol, the fight against a glass ceiling far stronger than I had imagined. With this robust documentary base, I began to structure a strategic plan to transform my legal argument into a forceful social denouncement. I worked to transform what seemed like cold data into a persuasive narrative that could be understood both in the courtroom and in the corridors of the legal market and beyond. I knew that only then would my fight have a real impact. Every detail of the investigation was meticulously aligned to create a timeline, a structural network that highlighted not only the facts, but also the consequences, financial, legal, and moral, of the decisions made by those who refused to acknowledge my work. My plan was for this revelation to dismantle not only the arguments of Mark, Sophia, and Carlos, but also to make the system itself question itself, paving the way for deeper changes. As Sophia moved to consolidate her position, her dynamic of appropriating my proposals became my silent advantage. I followed her tracks and anticipated her moves, enjoying the advantage of someone who knows the board better than the opponent imagines. The strategy was neutral, impersonal, guided by the logic of the game and mastery of information. Similarly, Mark, possessing formal power, believed in the monopoly of control, and dismissed the clauses I developed as an impediment to business agility. His arrogance was captured in internal documents and conversations that were now part of my arsenal, the missing proof to highlight the power play behind the corporate facade. At the intersection of the cold analysis of data and my practical experience, I found the balance to align the emotion of injustice with the technique of corporate law. All of this converges to a strategy that not only disarms opposing arguments, but reverses the game, giving me the recognition that was denied to me and exposing the contradictions of the system. Whenever doubt threatened to appear, the phrase that guided me from the beginning gained renewed strength. They forgot who drafted the contract. Now, this phrase was not just a statement. It was the banner of a larger struggle, the fight to break the glass ceiling that had for so long blinded victims of veiled machismo and perverse internal politics. The path was arduous, but the certainty that each small advance would strengthen not only me but many others fueled my determination. I was ready to transform this investigation into a definitive turning point in my career and reinforce that justice cannot be done in silence, leaving aside those who build it with precision and dedication. Thus, The days of those weeks blended into hours dedicated to analysis, strategy, and the construction of the plan that would give my voice the weight and reach it deserved. Because finally, I was no longer willing to be a spectator in my own invisibility. I was ready to shatter the glass ceiling, and I would do it with evidence, intelligence, and strategy, so that no one would ever forget who drafted the contract. Among the carefully organized documents on my desk, the digital files on my computer screen, and the scribbled notes that even I couldn't fully decipher, it was clear that what had begun as a personal battle far surpassed my individual plight. The contract I drafted, that clause disregarded by Mark and Sophia, was the guiding thread of a silent revolution in the American corporate landscape. At that decisive moment, a client with an avant-garde profile, discreet but visionary, contacted me. His name wasn't known to most, but his influence was about to shake the foundations of the legal and business world. He had been following my career from afar, was aware of the injustices that we, committed and honest professionals, face daily, and saw an opportunity to change the game. It was with him that I nurtured the confidence needed to bring to fruition the plan I had been secretly developing. The key point: he was at the forefront of a process that would bring that ignored clause to the center of a revolution in corporate legislation, a case that promised not only to resolve a specific conflict, but to establish a new standard for the legal treatment of contracts in the United States. The irony was cruel, but sweet. Those who tried to minimize my work unwittingly gave me the weapons I needed to elevate myself. The plan we outlined was ambitious and meticulous. It wasn't simply a matter of discussing that clause in a courtroom, but of challenging an entire system that relegated talent and competence to the background, based on prejudices and outdated logic. We had confidence in the law, but we reinforced our argument with robust documentation and the connections I had previously uncovered, demonstrating that it wasn't an isolated issue, but a systemic one, a matter of social and professional justice. In addition to the legal aspects, we built a strategy that considered the media impact and market pressure. In a time when transparency and social responsibility are increasingly important, showing the public and investors that archaic practices of underestimation were obstacles to progress could be the key to transforming the internal landscape of law firms and corporations in general. It was time to give a voice to all the Lauras who had been rendered invisible. Preparing this giant was an exercise in patience, intelligence, and strategy. Between discreet meetings with partner lawyers, meticulous contacts with specialists from different areas of corporate law, and even strategic communication consulting, every step was carefully considered to ensure that the impact of the case was maximized. Aware of the opposing forces, I was careful to keep my name away from political maneuvering until the right moment. While Mark, Carlos, and Sophia still believed they could control the situation with their internal machinations, I worked in silence, preparing the ground for a movement that would not only reclaim my place, but would cause a structural redefinition of how talent is recognized in the legal field, a blow to the old system that sustained them. Moments before the filing of the lawsuit, anxiety and excitement seemed to walk hand in hand. I worked tirelessly until the last minute, refining arguments, reviewing evidence, and adjusting the network of witnesses and collaborators who would be crucial in supporting our case. Every detail was worth its weight in gold, and I knew I was on the verge of a historic turning point. On the big day, a complaint with the force of truth and justice was presented before the court, supported by an argument that reflected not only a contract, but a human struggle, a demand for recognition that resonated with women, the marginalized, and all those who had never had a voice in the gears of corporate power. My performance was precise and calculated. Every word, every pause, every meticulous legal reference conveyed the conviction of someone who mastered not only the law, but the narrative that needed to be told. The hearing wasn't just a technical dispute. It was an arena where tradition and change, the old and the new, invisibility and affirmation clashed. Although I expected implacable resistance, which came intensely, especially from Mark and Carlos, with their outdated arguments based on conservatism, I had the confidence and support that neither of them could diminish. The case quickly gained notoriety not only in the courts, but also in specialized newspapers, blogs, and social media. The press took the opportunity to shed light on a problem that existed beneath the surface of corporations, bringing to light the story of many Lauras who faced the same professional and structural erasure. The repercussions amplified the impact of the action, pressuring those involved to reconsider their positions. Mark, who always worked with discreet manipulations, now found himself exposed. His arrogance stemmed from the false certainty of impunity, and his image began to crumble in the face of the clarity of the evidence and the force of my argument. Sophia, in turn, tried to circumvent the situation using the same tactics she used to undermine my career. But the terrain was no longer the same. Carlos, for his part, remained silent in court, possibly aware of his egregious failings. More than a personal victory, the outcome of that process represented the construction of a new paradigm of corporate justice. I felt that the dedication to hours of study, to emotional and intellectual investment, was resonating in something larger, fairer, and above all, transformative. The name that was once forgotten in notes and obscure clauses was taking its place in discussions, references, and, most importantly, in decisions. That achievement was not just mine, but that of all women who dare to challenge the hostile and dismissive environment they often encounter in the corporate and legal world. A spark that would extinguish forever the imposed silence. This phase of the plan, long and delicate, exceeded expectations. My self-confidence transformed every setback into a learning experience, every small victory into renewed fuel. I knew I was exactly where I should be, not on the sidelines, but at the center of the change. That institutional revolution had just begun, and I was leading it. The contract that many tried to erase was the cornerstone of a true transformation, and with it, the chance to show the world that, ultimately, no one can forget who actually drafted the contract. The day of the hearing arrived, marked by a palpable tension in the air. That moment represented not only the culmination of the battle I had meticulously planned, but also a watershed moment in my career, and essentially, for so many other women facing invisibility in environments dominated by oppressive structures. The courtroom, with its austere walls and watchful eyes, became the stage where I would demonstrate, with coolness and precision, that the contract I had drafted was not just paper, but an instrument of justice that they had striven to erase. Mark and Carlos were there, flaunting the arrogance of those who believe that power and status can manipulate any situation to their advantage. Sophia, with her calculating demeanor, accompanied them, ready to intervene at any moment, seeking to protect the interests and reputation they had long built at my expense. But I knew that every argument I presented, every detail I highlighted, would efficiently dismantle their old game. With a firm voice and piercing gaze, I pursued each line of the contract with the authority of someone who knows every comma, every seemingly technical term, and shows its true impact. I explained how that overlooked clause enabled equity and ensured essential rights for all parties involved, while they tried to minimize its importance with arguments based on conservatism and the maintenance of the status quo. The audience felt the weight of the clash. The press, eager for reports that would expose the disputes and reveal the human face behind legal formalism, captured every moment, prepared to amplify each step of this struggle that displayed, beyond a legal dispute, a demand for social and institutional change. With each word, my credibility grew, while that of my opponent slowly diminished, eroded by the solid foundation and clarity of the facts I presented. Sophia attempted, with the brilliance of her usual techniques, to intervene during the hearing, trying to weaken my evidence and dilute my arguments. However, her efforts were in vain. Her trajectory, exposed during the investigations, lifted a veil that revealed her behind-the-scenes maneuvers, weakening her stance before those present. She was more vulnerable than she had ever been, exposed to criticism not only from the court, but also from public opinion. Mark, the master of manipulation strategies and responsible for a cruel internal game, now faced the decline of his aura of invincibility. The arrogance that sustained him was dismantled by irrefutable evidence and the strength of my coherent and well-structured speech. Carlos, in turn, remained silent during the hearing, aware of the flaws and prejudices that could no longer be ignored in that arena. When I reached the heart of my argument, the forgotten clause, a respectful silence filled the room. It was as if, at that moment, the importance of that old wording translated into the real possibility of equity and transformation. I showed that this document was not a mere bureaucratic formality, but a symbol of the struggle to guarantee respect and justice, not only for me but for all those who face systems designed to silence them. Outside the courtroom, the repercussions were rapid and intense. The market reacted to the news, driven by the growing awareness of the need for change. Clients, investors, and entrepreneurs began to question and reassess contracts, internal policies, and the behavior of legal and corporate teams. The impact was especially felt at Mark and Carlos's firm, which saw its prestige fall, reflected in the loss of partnerships and position in the legal sector rankings. This case became a landmark in legal and corporate circles. Its relevance is debated in congresses, seminars, and roundtables, and associations and entities began to consider initiatives to combat discrimination and promote equity in legal work. My trajectory became a reference for other women who, once silenced, sought recognition and space. Despite all the transformation and achievements, I didn't feel the expected euphoria. Sobriety and focus were my companions. The feeling was one of a mission accomplished, but also of responsibility for many journeys that still needed to be undertaken. As I wrote and spoke of the results, I knew the fight continued. But now I was positioned not as a victim, but as a protagonist and catalyst for change. My name, previously forgotten in notes and documents, began to be spoken with respect in meetings, conferences, and negotiations. The prestige gained was the result of a combination of technical rigor and the courage to confront a system that wanted to erase me. Mark and Carlos continued to resist, but their traps and arguments visibly lost strength. Sophia, in turn, retreated, eclipsed by the light of justice that I had kindled. In the daily life of the office, I noticed the most subtle and perhaps most significant change. The respect for my work became palpable. I was no longer an almost ignored voice, but a reference, an example for younger colleagues, and for so many who sought a safe path amidst the shadows of unfair competition. The victory in court was the starting point for a trajectory that pointed me beyond traditional law. I became a mentor and encourager, dedicated to opening paths for other Lauras willing to face their own ceilings. With patience, strategy, and determination, I continued to face the challenges that would inevitably arise, knowing that constant vigilance is the price for maintaining the conquest. In that moment of calm after the storm, I silently repeated to myself, "They forgot who drafted the contract, but I haven't forgotten them." Because the pursuit of justice is continuous, and that glass ceiling, though cracked, will only be completely shattered through the persistence of all who refuse to be silent. After the battle, the euphoria some might expect didn't arrive. Instead, I felt a quiet, steadfast tranquility, the solid, silent feeling of a mission accomplished. This wasn't just any victory, but the result of a long journey filled with difficult choices, sleepless nights, and strategic coolness. And I knew deep down that this achievement didn't end the fight. It merely opened new paths to be trod. My name, long hidden in the shadows of oblivion, now resonated strongly in rooms that once ignored me. In the meetings I attended, the conferences I was invited to, the negotiations I led, I felt respect arising not just from my knowledge, but from the courage everyone finally recognized. There was a palpable transformation in how I was perceived, but more importantly, in the stories I inspired, in the example I set for other women who, like me, found invisible walls erected around them. Mark and Carlos resisted, of course. They continued using their old strategies, confident in the stability of the structures they themselves had helped build. But their fortress began to crumble in the face of evidence and the collective will for change. The arguments and maneuvers that once held weight now sounded hollow and outdated. Sophia, who had remained in the shadows, revealed herself to be a shadow indeed, unable to compete with the light that was destined to shine. She had to retreat, as did many of those who prefer the comfort of exclusion and silence. In the day-to-day life of the office, I felt another, even deeper change. It wasn't the formal conversations or the protocol gestures. It was genuine respect, the appreciation of my work as a real example of excellence and resilience. Many times, younger colleagues sought my advice, my support, and I saw in them the same flame that, for so long, I had needed to keep burning, to keep moving forward. Being a role model didn't make my journey easier, but it made it even more meaningful. The court victory marked the beginning of a new phase, one that transcended the limits of traditional law. I took on the role of mentor, a guide for those who wanted to know that it was possible to overcome their own ceilings, to break down barriers with method and courage. Patience, strategy, and determination became the tools I passed on to other fighters, because I know that constant vigilance is the only way to preserve and expand our achievements. As the dust of the storm settled, in a moment of silence and reflection, I repeated to myself that phrase that has always guided me. They forgot who drafted the contract, but I haven't forgotten them, because the justice I built is not a period, but an unbreakable commitment. I know that the glass ceiling, though cracked, still needs to be completely shattered, and this feat will only be possible with the persistence and unity of all who refuse to remain silent. The journey ahead will be long, certainly, but looking back and acknowledging each step taken, I don't feel fear. I feel the strength of certainty that comes from someone who has been through the darkness and can now illuminate the path. And so I will continue, firmly, accompanied by the legacy I have built and the future I help to shape, because true victory is collective.